Hey everyone, and welcome to our midweek Bible study time as we continue to look at the book of Ezra. Just as a reminder, what we looked at last week is we had a kind of a large introduction to the book. The exiles, the people that Nebuchadnezzar had taken the Jews from Jerusalem to Babylon, 900 miles away, in what we would consider today to be modern day Iraq. And he took them there. They destroyed everything, destroyed the temple, destroyed the city, set fire to things, the temple, the gates there, everything was left just a pile of rubble. And now here we are 70 years later, and the Jewish people have survived, and they have thrived, and they have grown, and children have been born, and they have planted roots here in Babylon, and the Medes come in, and the Persians come in, and they defeat the Babylonian Empire. Now the Persian Empire is overall, and King Cyrus sets out a decree that the Jewish people go back to Jerusalem in order to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple. And I just want to revisit for a minute verse 1 of Ezra chapter 1, where it says, "In the first year of Cyrus of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah." We looked at that last week. This is what I want you to remember. The Lord moved the heart of Cyrus. God works in a lot of amazing ways, and the principle that we wanted to look at last week was the fact of the matter that God is always in control, and God has a purpose for your life. No matter what's going on around you, no matter what's happening, God has a plan, and God has a purpose, and God will use you. He will move your heart. But there's another principle that we need to understand here, and that comes in verse 5 as we continue the text today. In verse 5, it continues after Cyrus gives his decree. It says, "Then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests, and the Levites," and then here's this phrase again, "everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem." And this is the second principle that I want you to understand. Everyone whose heart God moves needs to go. Everyone whose heart God moves needs to be obedient. You know, sometimes it comes in a small, just a feeling that comes over you where you see an individual and that the Spirit says you need to talk to them. You need to pray for them. You need to go ask them if there's anything you can do for them. And for you to not do that is to be disobedient, is to not go. That everyone whose heart God had moved prepared to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Such an important principle for us today, that especially during this time, if God moves us where we're all at home, we're all kind of in self-isolation, and we're going out just for the necessities, and they're closing non-essential places and people where people are working, and so we can spend more time on the phone. And so I'll just tell you, if God moves your heart to call somebody and lay somebody on your heart that says, "Hey, you know, I haven't called to talk to them in a while," you need to be obedient. They need to call that individual and see how they're doing. So they prepare to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild, but they don't go back empty-handed. It's not as though they're all stuck in slavery and now they all have to just march back with nothing. No, that's not what happens. Let me read verse 6 on for you for a moment. It says, "All their neighbors assisted them with articles of silver and gold, with goods, and with livestock, with valuable gifts, in addition to all the free will offerings. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had placed in the temple of his God." If you remember, when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed the temple, they took all of the treasures and everything that was used there to worship God. They took it back to Babylon, put it in their own temples to use to worship their own gods. And so Cyrus even says here, go get all of those items and bring them here. In verse 8, Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought by Mithredath. Okay, I think I got that name right. He was the treasurer at the time. He counted them out to another individual named Sheshbazzar, who was the prince of Judah. And this was the inventory. And he gives inventory: gold dishes, silver pans, golden bowls, matching silver bowls, and other articles. And it lists the numbers there. In all, verse 11 says there were 5,400 articles of gold and of silver. And Sheshbazzar brought all these along with the exiles when they came from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now, what does this remind you of? When they're giving away all of these gifts and they're doing all of this, for any of those who have remember the story of the Exodus from Egypt, when God's people were brought out, when he brought them and led them out and they crossed the Red Sea. As they were leaving, the Egyptians were throwing stuff at them, giving them all sorts of things as they went on their way. And all of those items that they gave them were used to build the tabernacle. And as they went around in the desert to build the tabernacle, they used all of those items. That's the same thing that's going to happen here. They're going to use all of these items. This is how it's going to go. And if we looked at Exodus chapter 12, in verse 35 and 36, it says, the Israelites did as Moses instructed, asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold for clothing, and the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people. They gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. So even then, the Lord caused that to happen. And even now, as we look at Ezra, the Lord moved the hearts of the people in order to do this. He moved the heart of Cyrus. And when God moves the hearts and people respond in obedience, that means God will provide. God will provide for them. We don't always see it in the moment. Sometimes we do, just like these people did. But more often than not, we see it after the fact. And so we need to learn how to be obedient when God moves our hearts and live in that moment, being gracious for what he has given us and how he's supplied all of our needs. You know, Jeremiah, again, chapter 27 of Jeremiah, he prophesies about this as well. And he says, yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says about the things that are left in the house of the Lord and in the palace of the king of Judah and in Jerusalem. They will be taken to Babylon, and there they will remain until the day I come for them, declares the Lord. Then I will bring them back, and I will restore them to this place. This is so amazing. This is prophetic words, and just as Jeremiah prophesied about it, it is happening. Because God keeps his promises. And God always remains faithful. With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are impossible. It reminds us of the disciples in the book of Matthew talking to Jesus about salvation. And they ask him the question, who then can be saved? How hard it is to become saved. And Jesus simply responds, with man, it's impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God. Just like God led his people out of Egypt, God is now leading his people out of captivity, where he's purged them of their idolatry, where he's purged them of their self-sufficiency. And now he said, after 70 years, just like I told you, now it's time to come back. It's time to rebuild the temple, and it's time to worship the way I have called you to worship. It's God's power and God's justice. It's God's faithfulness. It's God's mercy, and only he could do that. Let me just remind you today, whatever you're going through in life, it may seem impossible right now, but it's not impossible. Not with God. Nothing is. And so no matter what you're going through, whether it's anxiety or depression, depression is widespread for so many people, and it's so much of that depends on the seasons. I mean, we just spent winter time, and the skies are gray, and that has such a great effect on so many people. And now it's supposed to be spring, and the weather's supposed to be changing, and it's supposed to be warming up, but instead of being able to warm up and get out of the house, now we're all stuck in the house. Now we can't get out and do the things that we want to do, and so there's a struggle there. Let me tell you, nothing is impossible with God. Lean into his arms and trust in him during this time, and it'll be okay. He will take care of you. He will provide for you. And then that kind of leads us into chapter 2. That covers chapter 1, and in chapter 2, we're going to kind of bounce around here for a second, but what we find basically is a census taken of everybody who's coming back. We don't know the exact number of those who were taken into exile into Babylon. We have some rough estimates through the scripture and the history and the prophetic words of Jeremiah, but we don't know the exact number. But here we get a number of those who are able to come back. In verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, now these are the people of the province who came up from the captivity of the exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken captive to Babylon. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. in company with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvod, Rehum, and Banah. And then the list goes on from there. These are the leaders. Zerubbabel is the one who leads this first wave of Jews back to Jerusalem. He is considered a high priest and a scribe of the time, much like Ezra, a great leader during this time. Zerubbabel is from the line of King David, and so he has a right to the leadership. But as we read about him a little more in the next few chapters, as we look at him, you'll realize that God has given him great leadership qualities as well. He is somebody who God has called also to use to lead the people back and to rebuild the temple and to build the altar and the foundation. I want you to skip over, if you will. I'm not going to read through all of the list of people who are being brought back, but I do want to go towards the end of the chapter here in verses 64 and 65, because this is kind of where we get the number of those that are coming back at this time. And in verse 64 it says this: the whole company numbered 42,360, and besides there 7,337 men servants and maidservants. So they had 42,360 Jewish people, plus those that were there to serve them. That they were part of their families, that were men servants and maidservants, and they were there. So they were all coming back. But they also had 200 men and women singers. This is kind of like, this is interesting. The 200 men and women singers go with them. This is a 900-mile trek back, and so why wouldn't singers come back? Music is such a big part of our worship, and God is leading them back to Jerusalem. Of course, they would be singing songs of praise and worship. It's like a caravan rejoicing and singing unto the Lord as they go back to rebuild the temple. It's really, really kind of cool when you think about it. And then it also says all the animals and everything that they had. They had 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. So there's a lot of people coming back and a lot of animals coming back with them. The total number, if you add those up, comes to around 49,897. This is the first wave, like I said, that comes back. And when we get into chapter 7 and 8 especially, we'll see the second wave of Jews that come back, led by Ezra himself, and we'll look at that. That number there that Ezra leads back is actually just under 1,800. So it's a big drop, a big significant drop from 49, almost 50,000 people to now about 1,800 people, 1,700 and something, but about 1,800 people. And then the third wave that comes is Nehemiah, and we'll read about that later. And in Nehemiah, we don't even know what the number is, so it's probably less people that come back. And I think most of the Jews had adapted to the lifestyle that was in Babylon. And they had built homes there. They felt secure there. Probably those that didn't want to go back, maybe they were scared. Maybe they were scared to go back. Maybe they were afraid of what was to find. Maybe they had built up a life there and created their family there, and they were just too afraid to leave. They were too self-sufficient, too comfortable. That's a big idol for us today. You hear me talk about that if you're familiar with our church. One of our greatest idols today is comfort. None of us want to be led to be uncomfortable, and we want to be self-sufficient, and we want things our way. And there's this overarching theme in our lives that if something's making us uncomfortable, we have to fix it, or we have to pull ourselves out of the situation and make it right. But sometimes God brings us through those moments where we're uncomfortable. We've got to get out of our comfort zone. Look at what is happening around us. You can't deny that God is trying to get our attention. That this is something that is a result of sin. This is not a result of God, but God will use things for His purpose. He will allow things to happen so He can conquer or complete His will and His plan in everyone's life. He's taken away the idol worship of sports. He's taken away our idol worship of celebrities, and taken our idol worship of a lot of different things, where we've entertained ourselves, and he's kind of stripped us down. What a great time for us to focus on the Lord, to spend a little more time each and every day to focus on him. What opportunities will God bring along our way that we need to respond to? What opportunities will he bring that we don't respond to because we're too comfortable or because we're too scared? We need to be obedient to God. When God moves the heart of his people need to go. That's what they need to do. When God stirs your heart, you need to be obedient. There's an example of this in the book of Matthew. I'm going to flip over there as well. In Matthew 25, and there's a parable there that Jesus tells. And parable, I learned a long time ago, is parable is really an earthly story that has a heavenly meaning. If we had to strip it all down to what it is. And in this parable, he talks about loaned money. And in the parable, it says this in chapter 25, starting verse 14. He says, again, it's like a man going on a journey who calls his servants and entrusts his property to them. To one he gives 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents of money, and to another 1 talent of money, each according to his ability. I want you to remember that. If you have your copy of God's Word with you, underline that. Each according to his ability. Remember that. He went on his journey, the man did, and the man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with 2 talents gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 talent went off. He dug a hole in the ground. He hid his master's money in the ground. And after a long time, the master of those servants returned and wanted to settle accounts with them. So the man who had received 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, hey, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied with this statement, and this is the statement we all love. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many. Come and share in your master's happiness. The man with 2 talents then comes, and he says, hey, you've entrusted me with 2 talents. See, look, I've gained 2 more, master. His master replies to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come, share in your master's happiness. And then the man who received the 1 talent comes. Master, he said, I know that you're a hard man. I know you harvest where you have not sown, and you gather where you have not scattered seed. Now underline this phrase. So I was afraid. I was afraid. So I went out and I hid your talent in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. This is how the master replied. He says, you wicked, lazy servant. So you know that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I return, I would have at least received it back with some interest. Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has, will be taken from him and thrown. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Of course, this is a parable of heaven and hell. It's a parable about what you do with what God has given you according to your ability. And just like the people who didn't come back from Babylon, who may have been too comfortable or too afraid, they didn't do what God called them all to do. They didn't obey and follow what God had promised them. And so what was left for them was outer darkness, and they had no share in their master's happiness. Think about those people in Babylon who were not coming back, who were staying where they were, who were not going to be able to share in the happiness of their Father as they rebuild this temple and this place to them. And then I want to continue to read as we go back to Ezra. I want to look at some of the end verses there in verse 68. Because this, I want you to hear something here. It says, when they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. Now remember, they're going back 900 miles to a rubble, to nothing. There's nothing there. There's no homes. Everything has been destroyed. The gates are destroyed. Temples destroyed. The altars destroyed. Foundation, the market, nothing. Everything's gone. And when they arrived at the house in the Lord of Jerusalem, some of the heads of the families gave freewill offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. Some people gave. This is another principle I want you to understand. When God moves the hearts of people to give, the people will be obedient and give. That's an important aspect to remember. And verse 69, here's that phrase. And this is why I made the connection with Matthew 25. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for this work. And then it lists what they gave there. You know, not everybody is able to give the same thing all the time. But everybody is able to give according to their ability, according to what God has entrusted to them. You know, when it comes to giving and it comes to tithing, we like to say 10%. 10% off the top, no matter what, that's the way it be. But I know from personal experience and firsthand experience, sometimes you're not able to give 10%. But trust me, God has given you the ability to give according to what He has given you. And when God moves your heart, you need to be obedient, and you need to do so. What matters to God is given from a heart in obedience to His purpose and obedience to His kingdom. Everyone whose heart God has moved will give. There's a fourth principle here. This one is everyone whose heart God has moved will get involved. Everyone whose heart God has moved will get involved. Now, I want to look back at the text. I want to go back just a few verses and look at verse 61, 62, a couple verses there. This will kind of end our Bible study for tonight. In verse 61, it talks about the people from among the priests. And it says the descendants there of Hobiah. And then it lists Hakaz and Barzillai, and a man who married daughter of Barzillai the Gileadite. He was called by the first name. And they were searching for their family records, verse 62. And see, family records were so important there. You know, we talked a minute about Zerubbabel and how he was a descendant of King David, which was why he was in the place that he was. And these records were so important because Cyrus had told them to go back and settle in the land where their families had been. And so if they didn't have these records, they didn't know some of them might have not have known where their family was supposed to be or where they were supposed to be, what land they had right to. And so it was extremely important. We see this when we look in Matthew chapter 1, where Matthew lays out the genealogy of Jesus. And the reason he does that is to show how Jesus is the rightful heir to the throne. He is the king and he is the Messiah. He is the Jewish Messiah that the people have been waiting for. That's why it's so important. And we have to understand that in this context and in this culture. And these here, Hakaz and his family, they searched for their family records, but they couldn't find them. And so because they couldn't find them, they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. Until they were able to be vindicated, they would not be able to be a part of the priesthood like they were supposed to be. Even though they knew they came from this line, they had to be able to prove it. And they had to do that. So the governor there ordered them not to eat any of the most sacred food until there was a priest ministering with the Urim and Thummim. There's kind of strange words there, and so I want to explain them to you. I want to explain what's happening here. In Exodus 28, when God's people are brought out of Egypt, He leads them across the Red Sea. They have all of these items, and they're setting up the tabernacle. In Exodus 28, it talks about making the breastplate for Aaron, who was the high priest. And on this breastplate would have been jewels for each tribe. And he also, on the breastplate or around his neck, would have had a little pouch. And in the pouch would have been 2 stones. And the names of the stones were Urim and Thummim. And the reason these stones were there was so that he could judge things appropriately. And so basically what would happen is he could have these small rocks in the pouch, and when a decision needed to be made, it was kind of like casting lots, what we talk about casting lots. He would shake the bag up, he would reach in, the priest would pray to God, reach in, and pull out one of them. If he pulled out the Urim, that meant curses on the individual. That meant whatever they wanted, the decision would go the other way. But if he pulled out the Thummim, that meant perfections. And so that meant, in this case, for these people, they were to go until the priest ministering came to them with the Urim and Thummim. So until the priest came to them and pulled out the Thummim from the bag that said perfections. You are a part of the Levite tribe. God has led us to this decision. They could not partake in anything that was going on. They couldn't eat of any of the sacred food that was there until the priest had done this. And so that's what's going on here. Apparently what this was is they couldn't find their family records. And so they needed somebody to vindicate them before God, before they could be a part of the family, the priestly family there. You know, this is really interesting because we also need somebody to vindicate us before God. We cannot come before God. We have no claim to His holiness. We have no claim to His presence, and so we also need a priest who will intercede for us. And in our case, we have that high priest. Hebrews 12 and verse 1 tells us we have a high priest who knows everything that we have gone through and yet is without sin. And He has died for us, and His name's Jesus. We have that vindication in Jesus Christ, where we can come before God and we can come before His holiness. See, our sin is what separates us from God. But Jesus, by His blood on the cross, has taken that price for us that our sin deserves so that we can come into His presence. You know, and there was a huge exodus from Egypt where God led His people out, where He used a man named Moses and a man named Aaron to lead this people. There's another exodus here in Ezra where God has taken His people into Babylon. They've been overthrown, and now there's a great exodus to come back to God, to come back and rebuild and to start over and to put God in His rightful place as king. The people had gotten away from that. But you know what? We also have an exodus from our sin and from this world. And that exodus is given to us by Jesus Christ. We have a chance to start over. I've always told people it's not about becoming a better person. That's not what Jesus came to do. Jesus tells us in Mark, He came to save sinners, period. That doesn't mean He makes you a better version of yourself. It doesn't mean He makes you a better person or that you now have some better moral kind of qualities or standing. Jesus comes, and when you repent and trust in Him, He makes you a completely different person. You are a new creation. You are not the same. As Paul says, I am crucified with Christ. Therefore, I no longer live, but Christ lives within me. The world has nothing to offer me. And that's what we're seeing during this time. That the world really has nothing to offer us. I mean, everybody's hoarding all of these items and trying to make the best of the situation. And they want to say that, well, these people are blowing this out of proportion and these people are making this a bigger deal than it should be. And, you know, sometimes it's not about right or wrong. It's about being responsible, making the right decisions for our society, for each other, taking care of each other. But even that won't get us into heaven. Only Jesus Christ can do this. This is what He does for you. He frees us from our sin and from our bondage that sin has us in. And this is God's faithfulness to us. First, He moves our hearts. Just like He did the people here and just like He did Cyrus. He moves our hearts to repentance. It's not something in and of ourselves that we can do. Only God does this. For it is by grace you are saved, not of works, lest anyone should be able to boast. The second thing He does is He moves us to go in obedience, to tell other people about His goodness, to tell other people about the wonderful things He's done, His grace and His mercy. And as we do this, we should be faithful in giving all of ourselves to Him. Everything we are and everything we do should be given to Him in His glory. These are the principles that I want you to learn today. God has a plan and a purpose for you. This is what we're learning as we go through Ezra. He has a plan and a purpose for you. And everyone whose heart God moves will go, will give, and will get involved. We can't just sit back on the sidelines. We got to get involved because God has made us a new creation. How important it is that we carry that on. Because God works through His church and His people. So that's our lesson for this week. You know, I pray you have a wonderful week. Next week we'll come together. We talk about the rebuilding of the altar and the temple and some of the opposition that they find there. And I pray this study will will be meaningful to you, will help enrich your life, and you'll be able to see and connect how God has always been faithful through the years, how the Old Testament reveals the New Testament, reveals Jesus Christ, the types of Jesus and the symbols that Jesus that are used here that are fully realized and fully found in Jesus Christ, because that's what it all boils down to, is who is Jesus to you. I pray you have a wonderful week, and join us on Sunday for our message. We'll have that up on video as well on our website. And Brother Robert Strunk will also be doing Facebook Live for our Sunday school lesson, so you'll want to join in for that also. Keep an eye on our Facebook page throughout the week. I'll be posting videos on there and different things to help you grow and spirit and truth, and maybe some videos that you can sing along to and worship with, and we can all do that together. So pray you have a great week. God bless.